Si tout le monde est là, on va peut-être commencer.
I think we can start. Hello, everybody.
Qui s'intitule Lutter contre la faim.
Thank you for joining the session, Combating Hunger, Working for Peace. Let us start.
La récente pandémie est venue rappeler
The recent pandemic reminded us of the importance of agriculture and food at a world scale. COVID-19 has created instability, and states have
sous-alimentation.
run to get some food. Unfortunately, this issue did not wait for COVID-19. 690 million people in the world were already underfed. Food has been ongoing since a few years now. By 2030, more people will be affected by hunger. In 2021, in Yemen, more than half of the population is suffering from hunger. 400,000 children may die of malnutrition. In Afghanistan, 1 person out of 3
Des effets combinés.
has issues with food security because of global warming and war. Nobel Prize was given to the World Food Program to highlight the issues and challenges of food security at a global level.
Qui se succèdent.
Due to the various crises, there is a great need for solidarity and cooperation at multilateral level. This is even more so necessary to put an end to this disaster. In order to discuss these issues, we have Sébastien Abyss with us here today. He's a researcher at IRIS, and he's published every year a new book or magazine. This is a 27th edition. We also have Claire Guillon. She's a facilitator. We also have 2 people joining us by video conference. We have the ambassador. She is a permanent representative for agriculture and food, and Eric Pichon, who is a policy analyst at the European Parliament Research Service. And they will give us an overview on this topic.
Donc, je vous propose de commencer.
Now, let's start with Céline Jurgensen, if the video is functioning well. I do not see her.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. Thank you
Invité
for inviting me.
le public.
I want to greet the audience. I'm delighted to be back at the forum, Normandy Forum for Peace.
Il y a quelques années.
A few years back, I was here under different status or function. As you said, the situation, unfortunately, has been declining even more. Hunger has always been
Créé ici, c'est-à-dire dans
concerned since the after-war period. We are facing an aggravation, a decline of the situation in terms of food safety in the world, or insecurity, rather. Even before the pandemic,
revenir des raisons.
there were also other structural reasons for this decline. The first one is conflicts, armed conflicts, but also natural disasters, global warming, economic crisis. These are the consequences or the elements which cause also food insecurity. We've also seen a decline, a degradation of this situation in the world through COVID pandemic. The COVID crisis has speeded up this trend, which was already very alarming. This trend, mainly regarding lack of food safety, we will continue to see these trends.
Par des ressources économiques beaucoup plus faibles.
What we are seeing
Le directeur
is that there is an uncertainty.
mentionné comme le risque d'une véritable.
There is a risk of a pandemic for hunger. After the health pandemic, there is a risk of of hunger pandemic. Consequences, mainly economic consequences of this pandemic, is striking regions and populations which are already very vulnerable. As you said, the year 2020 saw an increase, the highest increase of food uncertainty since a number of years. 800 million people, this is the last report, 811 million people were suffering from chronic hunger. And if we add to this figure malnutrition, we're talking about 2 billion people who are not eating sufficiently, who are not eating well, or who are overeating. Therefore, this crisis is mainly affecting the most populated, the most vulnerable populations, mainly the children. More than 39 billion of school meals have been served during the pandemic. And as we are working with the World Food Program and other stakeholders to try to improve the nutrition, the school meals that are needed, there is great vulnerability through the pandemic, also hitting sectors and regions which were already vulnerable, especially in Africa. More than half of these people affected by this food uncertainty are to be found in Africa. We're talking about 133,000 people who are really in a situation of famine. Africa is threatened by famines like it has not known for the last 20 years. As you can see, the situation was already degraded before. Unfortunately, is continuing to degrade at a time when finances is not following or sufficient, and at a time when priorities are focusing on essential needs. Therefore, the pandemic of the COVID-19 is also highlighting the gaps, the lacks of our systems, multilateral system of our agricultural and food systems, and that was one of the challenges that the Secretary of the UN has just organized last week, 23rd of September and 24th of September. He organized this forum to show that these sectors can also bring solutions, and if we want to help combat hunger in the world, we also need to implement these solutions, which the agricultural sector can provide in terms of economy, in terms of our environment, social, and to continue to produce in a more sustainable way in order to feed a population which will continue growing. We're talking here that by 2050, we're talking about up to 10 billion people in the world. How to feed more people in a more sustainable way, more social way for the planet and for the people. The agencies of the UN, which we are monitoring, it's not just the FAO, of course, but other organizations like the World Food Program, which is a humanitarian organization, and the Fund for Agricultural Development. These institutions are really at the heart of these challenges and combating and the fight against hunger. Just one last word. Your second remark was about the Nobel Prize on the World Food Program. They have received the Nobel Prize last year, I quote, for their efforts in fighting or combating hunger, for improving the conditions of peace in the areas which are affected by conflicts, and for playing a key role in the efforts in order to prevent the use of hunger as a war weapon in conflicts. Now we are talking here about the first element of this phenomenon, of this plague, is the conflicts. These are human reasons. Unfortunately, hunger famine is used as a war weapon in the world,
Conventions internationales.
as opposed to the national conventions. What we can do, France, but also as the international community with these international organizations, whatever we can do will help fight against hunger in the world and will contribute to the peace efforts, to development efforts in a sustainable way. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Claire Guillon pour une autre question.
I will now turn to Claire Guillon for another question. Insecurity, climate change are barriers, yet there is a connection between agricultural development and insecurity. The FAO says that 90% of people who suffer from hunger are suffering from familiar reasons. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the floor. AFD is French Farmers and International Development. This is an association which was created about 40 years ago to mobilize the farmers, the farming industry in the countries of the South. Of course, this issue of hunger is close to us. The majority of the people affected by hunger in the world are farmers themselves. How can we explain this today? How can we explain this in the 21st century, that those producing our food are actually the first to be affected by malnutrition or by hunger? As at AFD, we have identified a key issue, which is a lack of recognition of farmers in some countries. I think like in Madagascar, the business of farmers is not recognized. In Burkina Faso, a milk farmer is recognized as being a cleaning lady. So how could we expect from people who do not have an official status to get the necessary means in order to meet the needs for food in their own country? We have identified several levers, which is access to training for farmers, access to information. We see that the digital is developing, and we should be able to support our partners to access information and access to production, and give them the means, rather, for production. In Mali, in Burkina Faso, access, for example, to land is not something that's sustainable. Or how can we hope to have them in good conditions in order to feed the population? At AFD, we are defending an important role of the international organizations and the French government to continue to support family farming in the world, especially farming organizations in the world. We also defend another particularity on the market for defending food products, to have a multilateral regulations on the international market to provide a decent salary for those who feed us. You were talking about Burkina Faso. You have worked with a milk factory in Burkina Faso. Could you give us some examples? What are the consequences of global warming in Burkina Faso on the families, on the farmers and the cattle breeders? I will try to take you now to Burkina Faso to show you or present to you the environment of milk houses or dairy plants. In Burkina Faso, most of them are Peul. This is a tribe. In Burkina Faso, the amount of land dedicated to this sector is superior to France. There are populations living out of dairies. Peul people were nomads. They are now, they continue to practice moving from one region to another, even from one country to another, for their stocks to get their provision. They continue to do that. Therefore, their cattle, their cows are free to go and look for grass or for food anywhere now because of the demographic growth, strong demographic growth. There are some conflicts with the other users, which are the farmers. Some, on the one hand, defend the existence of these corridors that have been there historically and these practices of moving the cattle around, and the farmers are criticizing the damage that it is causing to their lands, and therefore that gave rise to some violence. Now I'm coming to your question, global warming, climate change in the areas where we are working in Burkina Faso in the center north. The rainy season lasts about 3-4 months. With climate change, now this is shortened. Therefore, the cycles for farming are much shorter. And of course, food uncertainty is also increasing. This is the first thing. I think insecurity, also due to jihadism, is also another element. Of course, the farmers or the cattle breeders that we are working with are very much present in the Sahel, where the jihadists are. Last year, when we were talking to our partners, they were telling us that when they have to deliver the milk from one village to another, could be a risk for their lives. This is a very complicated situation on a daily basis. The other factor is due to some confusion, and not just in Burkina Faso, but the whole sub-region between the Peul people and the jihadists. I would not get into details of the reason why, but the Peul people feel often unsafe, and many of them were killed or died. There is great poverty among that people. They are not the only one to be affected by this phenomena. We will continue on this topic. Bertrand Badi yesterday was explaining that food uncertainty was killing millions of people per year. But in 1952, José de Castro was saying in Geopolitics of Hunger that many phenomena have influenced, or the food phenomenon has been the most dominant. What is food uncertainty, and why is it a source of conflict?
Merci Thomas. Bonsoir.
Hello, Thomas. Hello, everyone.
Bonsoir.
Mrs. Ambassador, glad to see you again. I think we've heard from Céline Jorgensen and from Claire Guyon a number of important points with practical examples, like in Burkina Faso. And the view of 2021, an overview of 2021, which is not very advantageous. I think several things have to be reminded here in a forum with a title around the issue of peace. In Europe, we do not quite realize, and even in France in 2021, that for a great majority of people in the world, daily safety, security is about, for many people, about having something in their plates. We don't quite realize this because we are in a privileged situation. Historically speaking, we've never really had this. We do have an exceptional food safety if we compare ourselves to the rest of the world and if we look back in the mirror. What should we always remind people? There is a positive geopolitics that's really my thing for the last 15 years. There is a positive geopolitics with farming, with food and farming. The ambassador said it. There could be a use of the food issues as a tool during war or conflicts to control territories and people, and we can talk about food weapon, but in the great majority on a daily basis in our world today, food and farming are actually contributing to peace in the world. Why do I say this? Two things to show this. Food is vital, universal, and timely. Find another topic which concerns everybody on the planet, 8 billion people, every day, today, and in a year's time, COVID or without COVID. And for those who are like most of the people in Europe and in France who are in a safe situation, food-wise, we do this even several times a day. So this food issue is so powerful for our life, for our development, for our safety. I don't know if there is a creator. Our bodies, our organisms are so well made that there is like a little bell ringing when we feel hungry and we need to fill our stomachs. Now, if you take this to a region, territory, a country, or at the globe level, it's the same thing. When there is no food, quickly chaos comes in. There is dissatisfaction, there is hunger, and sometimes revolutions, revolts, and possibly war. So the lack of food has always generated at an individual level or at the level of a whole territory has always caused possible fragility, poverty, distress, isolation, incapacity to access food, which is why I'm always saying that farmers in the world, since the beginning of our history, have been doing an amazing and determining key role, are playing a key role for peace in the world. What I'm always saying that farmers are the blue helmet on the planet. It is good that the food program got the Nobel Prize in 2020, and it would be wonderful if we could give a Nobel Prize to the 1.5 billion producers, men and women who are producing food in the world. Without them, there would be no food security in the world for you and for the world. Food uncertainty, or what is it? When you take a territory for geographical reasons, lack of logistics, lack of resources, lack of access to the international market to meet the gap, or because of war or conflicts, a territory would have a difficulty in finding enough food for everyone and accessible by all. Now, the thing is that we have regions in the world are less productive, and there is also food inflation in some countries. Some people have actually lost their jobs. So it's a triple offense, if you like. Farming is an open sky plant or factory. Sometimes you may lose production because the weather has not been good. And if your industry is also depending on economy and you have maybe lost your job or lost your income, then you are completely compressed by the food invariability. It's geopolitics. When you have farmers, men and women, and therefore food production, without farmers, may I remind you, there is no food. Don't ever forget this. This is the oldest job in the world, the oldest job in the world, hold in its hands the future of our world. We think that agriculture belongs to the past, that it's a job that is not very modern, not turned toward the future. It's never been as contemporary as now. This food uncertainty is conditioned by the climate equation that we all talk about. We cannot forget about the climate issues in agriculture. Of course, agriculture has its role to play in gas emissions, but also is the first victim of climate changes. But it's at the heart of the solutions. And all of the agri-food actors, maybe like me, people here are not in this sector of activities. We can change our practices, but our lever at a global level is much weaker than what the world sector, the food or agricultural sector is doing in order to transform the future. The great challenge that is asked of our farmers is to feed the world. We're not going to ask them to stop feeding the world. It is conditioned to our world, but also we ask them to repair the planet. We tell them, look, you are so responsible. You have such a lever for transition. If you don't do the transition job for changing climate, we can do whatever we want. Without them, we are not going to be successful. First of all, there is not another job, another business or trade to which we ask so much, and understand also that this is our everyday safety and long-term safety. If we continue to see the same path amplifying and without correcting this, tomorrow there will be less food production, we will have more migration, more distress in the world, and there will be more tensions around the pricing of the food products, that only a very few rich countries will be able to continue eating 3 times a day. So we need to keep this in mind. Beside the climate challenges, and which is of course key, the agricultural issue is absolutely key. We need farmers to bring peace. Without the farmers, we will not be able to bring peace, even at a climate level. Soldiers for peace, soldiers for climate. It has been said, farmers, men and women, farmers are here. Without them, there can be no peace. Without them, there can be no future. I'm dreaming of a Nobel Prize for all world farmers.
Thank you, Sébastien. Yes, indeed.
On va se tourner justement.
Let's now turn to Mrs. Ambassador, if you would like to react to what Sébastien said. And I wanted to ask you, what are doing international organizations today to fight against hunger, and the objectives of the CNUDD, are they attainable, reachable?
On vous entend pas. Je ne sais pas si vous nous entendez, mais.
We cannot hear you for the moment. Oh, now it's good. Thank you very much. Of course, I would like to answer to what Sébastien said. Of course, it's not me or France or international organizations who give the Nobel Prize of Peace, but this reminder is crucial because, as you said, we have a tendency in Europe to forget what is essential.
Et ailleurs dans le monde,
And elsewhere in the world, it's a daily issue. For a lot of African countries, it is the case, and populations must keep on.
uniquement avec
Everyone needs to look at the world not only with our French glasses, our French vision, but with a wider perspective, so wider vision. So this is absolutely fundamental. And yes, this is exactly what Sébastien Abis said. Concerning what international organizations are concretely doing, for this environment, we can see that the challenges are enormous, so global that only an international answer
d'avancer.
might help move forward. Organizations of the United Nations provide part of a solution. Of course, they are not the only ones. And to give you just a few examples,
Le programme alimentaire mondial
the World Food Program, as you said, is an organization that is turned towards operational. It works in the field. It is also based on logistics, and very concretely during the pandemic, while commercial flights were stopped,
alimentaire
the World Food Program ensured air transportation, and they sent freight, which also sent humanitarian personnel and brought back health employees as well. So it's a huge logistics, and I want to mention it because this is an activity that is not necessarily known, but it is fundamental, and we have seen this with the pandemics, and now it is visible with bringing vaccinations, having the vaccination arrive in the countries. So how can we do in a context in which the pandemic deprives children from going to school? The CPAM adapted these modalities of help distribution by providing food rations, food baskets. So this is just to give you a few examples for the CPAM, and what I wanted to say is that we are trying to strengthen our work with other actors, strengthen the action on the canteens in schools, and we are creating a momentum internationally to make sure that children who were deprived from going to school because of the pandemic be able to return to school. And why is food in school so fundamental? It could seem very simple, and I think that most of all when used the school canteen. For children around the world, for a lot of them, the meal at school is the only meal they will have in the entire day. So when you have children or girls, it's a whole objective for equality between girls and boys around education, but also for small farmers and the local economy, because we can put in place a whole positive dynamics. We are working on this with about 60 countries, 50 organizations that are international, but also research organizations, to see how we can help develop these programs for food at school. Another organization is the Organization for Food and Agriculture, FAO. This is a different action from the CPAM. It's an organization that is less on the field, but it is very important to organize training sessions and to show the way. Sébastien Abis indicated that we need the agricultural world, and namely in France, we must underline this, in France, must be involved in an environmental ecological transition. It's true everywhere in the world, and international organizations such as the FAO are important to give the direction, to support the different countries, support them in their efforts to make progress towards a sustainable agriculture for the environment, for the climate, of course, for the economy as well, since we mentioned decent revenue, decent incomes, and we cannot encourage farmers to adopt this transition if they don't have a decent income. So all this aspect of the sustainable transition for the environment, for the economy and society, these are international organizations such as FAO that can lead them. Then they can help concrete projects. We talked about the Sahel region. FAO is involved with the FIDA, Development Agricultural Fund I mentioned, to support concretely projects for the grain rural. So in the Sahara, in the Sahel, we try to develop these areas in terms of sustainable agriculture with sustainable projects, and FAO provides support to projects such as the Great Green Wall. The Great Green Wall. So we haven't talked about food and health, because it is deeply connected. When we talk about human health, animal health, we cannot only tackle things from one angle. This is why we work with FAO in order to create a network of experts who is going to work on this link between animal health, environmental health, human health, a sort of warning system in case of epidemics, to prevent the future epidemics and, when they happen, provide answers. The last organization is the International Fund of Agricultural Development, FIDA, and it is a bank and financial institution. The FIDA
pour des projets
gives money for agricultural projects, namely in Africa, and it is currently developing a coalition of agricultural banks for development to make progress in what we call green finance, which means, in fact, to make progress towards this sustainable agricultural for the climate, etc. A few examples, concrete examples of the way in which the three agencies here in Rome are working with the support, of course, of the member states, of which France and other partners, in particular European partners.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thank you for this transition towards Europe, because I'm going to give the floor to Éric Pichon. The EU promised help of a few million euros in Venezuela, Afghanistan. How is it mobilizing today against famine, and why is it an important actor?
Bonsoir. Merci beaucoup pour me donner la parole.
Hello, thank you very much for giving me the floor. As you said, one of the aspects that makes that the EU is an important actor is the financial ability that it can mobilize. You talked about these amounts for Venezuela, Afghanistan, Africa. Madam, the President of the European Commission last week announced 140 million for research and for food security. We see that direct help for food security from the EU is 7 million euros, etc. What is important to see is that globally, the EU and the member states represent half of the public help for development and humanitarian help globally. So, of course, all of this help for food security doesn't go directly to food security, but we see that the EU and the member states focus on the most fragile countries, countries experiencing conflict, and often it is in these countries at war and conflict that the situation is the most severe. We could talk about Yemen. There are many examples. So this is the first important element, and the EU has a big part to play. Another element is that the EU is a general actor, so it is not only a development agency, it is not only a humanitarian agency, it is an actor which puts in place a number of policies. And of course, food security is not only linked to conflict, it's linked to many other aspects which are intertwined. Climate, agriculture, etc., etc. The EU, with all of the policies developed, has different levers to act. The third element, which, of course, we need to take into account, is that the EU also is an actor, an important actor in terms of agriculture, for commerce as well, for trade. And within the EU, there are other effects on the third countries. So we help some other countries to make sure that the policies that we implement for ourselves don't have negative impacts on other countries. All of this, as I said, one of the main characteristics of humanitarian help and to develop the EU, without going into technical details, these are shared competences. And very simply, this means that the EU, the European Commission, the European Bank of Investment,
politique
have their policy for food security, but each member state can decide of its own policy for food security.
donc pour que l'Union
So,
soit une force
in order for the EU to be a true strength, to bring about change, there is a necessity to have a certain coherence. And
besoin
as Mrs. Jorgensen said, we need all of the actors
des objectifs convergents.
to have the same objectives.
De l'Union européenne, il y a ce qu'on appelle le
In the EU, we have what we call a consensus, European Consensus for Development.
un des objectifs
One of the clear objectives is to make sure that everyone
de la nourriture saine et
has access to healthy food in sufficient quantities. It was signed, the last version was signed in 2017 by the European institutions and the member states of the EU.
d'accord pour
It's an agreement for all of the policies in order to make sure that they all converge towards this objective. And this European consensus
explicitement
refers explicitly to the sustainable objectives. So what do they show?
agir sur
That acting on a problem
ne peut pas se faire sans
cannot be done without acting on other issues. There are 7
à une influence.
sustainable development objectives.
Donc voilà, ça c'est un premier aspect
So this is one point, and then to
sur ces différents
act on these different points which create insecurity, food insecurity. What is the EU doing?
par
On the one hand,
de l'aide alimentaire directe,
direct food help. So there's a humanitarian agency
qui intervient
which intervenes directly in zones of crisis.
une fois que
And
l'aide
once that this food help was provided, you need to make sure that in the long term, the crisis does not come back.
d'aide au développement
This is
qu'on doit-
one aspect of
avec l'aide
food
alimentaire
development help.
et
And
ça va de pair avec
this goes hand in hand with managing conflicts. We saw, for example, for Burkina Faso, if a farmer cannot deliver food to the next village, it is not any help providing help at some time if we don't put in place the right conditions to ensure security conditions for this
circuler
help
de façon viable.
and in order for it to circulate in a viable way. And
Il y a cette possibilité que l'Union européenne,
there is this possibility
l'aide alimentaire,
to articulate
l'aide au
food help, development help,
et puis évidemment
and of course, interventions of the EU for security.
d'autres aspects aussi
Other aspects also that are important
à prendre en compte,
and important to take into account, it is research.
une alimentation viable,
What is viable food, nutrition? How can you diversify your food to have healthy access to healthy food,
Madame Guillon l'a bien
healthy
dit, les
nutrition?
petits
It was
agriculteurs
said small farmers
le maillon essentiel
are the essential link in
Et malgré
the food chain.
sont les premières victimes du changement.
But they are the first victims of climate
une-
change. So there is a lot of research to carry out and monitoring to do to look at the crisis, see when they happen, why. It's very complex. You know that in a country,
alimentaire se développe
food crises develop brutally. In some countries, conflict exists, but there's no food, and so there's a whole monitoring to do. It's a complicated one to really work on the causes of hunger.
c'est une des caractéristiques
This is one of the characteristics of the EU, and
qui peuvent
all of the actors can put this in place.
l'aide humanitaire,
Humanitarian help.
recherche,
There are research centers as well, which collaborate with the research centers and the different organizations in Rome.
Et en plus, l'Union
On
européenne.
top of that, the EU has personnel on the field,
Donc ça aussi, c'est
people working on the field. So this is an important part.
prendre un exemple.
And to take an example, to come back to the example of the Burkina Faso, in the Sahel region, the EU has a strategy, a global strategy for Sahel. So there's a strategy for security,
Mission de l'Union européenne.
missions of the EU with forces of the member states, Barkhane force for France, for example. We have a force grouping several European countries to ensure security. But on top of that, security, which is ensured or guaranteed,
Des objectifs
we have objectives
contre la
in order to fight against food insecurity.
Je vous remercie.
Alors,
Vous
par exemple-
pouvez toucher un mot sur la PAC?
Thank you. Could you say a word about food sovereignty for Europe?
je vais y venir.
Yes, I'm going to come to it. Another important aspect,
Pour prendre un autre exemple,
to take another example,
pour le,
this is what I wanted to close on for the European action for example, dairy farming, the example of Africa. Here again, there's a global strategy of the EU
assurer la sécurité.
to ensure security with military missions,
il
training
y a-
of soldiers, and there's a navy force also, which is supposed to fight against piracy.
Des principaux
One of the main objectives of this mission
justement,
of the navy force is to support the ships of the food help that is
c'est
provided
aussi
to protect the boats.
montrer la relation
It shows clearly the close relation between security,
et sécurité alimentaire. Bon, encore un
food
social.
security,
Comme vous le demandiez, en fait,
health
par rapport à
security,
la PAC plus généralement,
and more generally,
aux politiques internes
when we look at internal policies in Europe, of course,
de l'Union européenne, et ça aussi, c'est dans les
this also is an important part of the European Treaty.
clairement,
It's said clearly that no policy of the EU can have contrary effects on the development of the third
voilà.
countries.
Donc ça, ce sont des choses qui sont
So this is clearly written in the treaties.
évidemment un certain nombre de
Of course, there are a lot of
qui existent
stakes and tensions that exist
pour la réforme
for the reform for common policy.
en cours qui est en train de
This is
et qui sera
being discussed, and it was probably be voted in Parliament by the end of the year. This policy
dit clairement
says clearly that, for example, help to agriculture farmers should not have a distortive effect on the market
des pays tiers
for
soient
third-party countries.
concurrentiels avec les produits
They should be in competition with European products.
production locale. C'est quelque chose
So
d'important.
this is something important. We talked about milk, and typically the problem of milk in West Africa
C'est un effet de distorsion du
has
marché.
an
Alors,
effect that distorts the market.
encore une fois, c'est
Once again,
qu'on brosse,
this is
qui
a
est-
picture that is made.
qui est une vision d'ensemble
It is a global vision
importante.
of what is important to do. Of course, you understand that there are a lot of tensions between all the objectives.
L'objectif des agriculteurs européens,
For European farmers,
sont les mêmes.
the problems are not necessarily the same or objectives are not the same for other
on pourrait en
farmers
discuter.
in
Les
other
objectifs
countries or in Africa.
de l'Union
But commercial objectives, trade objectives, are not necessarily the same than that of
des pays africains.
African countries. But this is also discussable. And it's all of these tensions
Qu'il faut mettre en
that we need
essayer
to try,
de coordonner, enfin d'apaiser quelque part.
coordinate, and to
Je pense que
make more peaceful. I believe that the
ont aussi
EU
leur...
institutions also have a role to play,
Justement, on va trouver,
and we will find the necessary agreements,
pour
I'm
revenir
sure.
sur le
And to come back to the EU Parliament,
je
since it's
travaille,
the
si vous
institution I
écoutez,
work for, if
il y a eu
you
lieu
listen to a debate which took place in September, a few
justement
weeks
sur...
ago, on food
Vous
security,
voyez très bien tous les enjeux
you saw all of the challenges with the
qui voudraient
reforms in policies,
de l'Union européenne à
wanting to make of the EU a standard
durabilité
of sustainability for food,
qui des
and that the United States dislikes, but it is the heart of discussions within the member states
entre
in
les
the
États membres de
EU
l'Union.
also.
Voilà, pour un tableau assez...
So this is for the picture, a global picture or landscape of all the tensions that exist. Thank you very much.
tourner vers Sébastien.
I'm going to turn to Sébastien for a last question, a metaphysical question, and then, of course, you will be able to ask your questions. Can we dream of sovereignty or power without food security? Yesterday, Sylvie Brunel explained that the great powers understood that food is so strategic. A Japanese paper said that it worried about land being purchased in China, for example. But
Pourquoi l'agriculture
why is agriculture and food at the heart of these geopolitical challenges, and who are the main actors? Thank you. So I could speak about this until tomorrow morning.
Non, deux choses.
So two things. First, coming back to Europe, because Éric Pichon mentioned the debates in the member states, at Parliament, no later than this morning in a French newspaper, the opinion, not to name it, the Vice President of the Agricultural Commission, the Italian Paolo De Castro, said, insisted on the importance for the Green Deal to push forward the importance of agriculture as a transitional lever.
Qui viennent d'être mentionnés, mais tout en rapport.
But by reminding the importance of producing food in Europe in the future. And
mais qui
I believe that this must be recalled as well. And let's underline also the fact that Europe was fighting for many years, did not discover water all of a sudden and the importance of agriculture. It made peace 70 years ago with, I believe, a special tone in Normandy, but it made peace by building cooperation and political European projects of living together starting from food security and agriculture, which means that the first contribution that I believe we must remind of Europe on food security is already the food security it's doing at home. So the greatest sovereignty of Europe since 70 years is to have built food security for 500 million of consumers. The common agricultural policy, PAC, is very badly named. Nobody cares about the farmers, and they think that the PAC is expensive. Is it the first community budget? The PAC is a citizen movement, which they don't know any food inflation compared to the rest of the world, because we have an organization of the markets which is quite admirable. And of course, farmers in Europe could question certain excesses. We need to optimize system, correct certain prices, but let's not forget that the big winner was the European consumer, and the greatest sovereignty when we talk about autonomy and strategy, it's in farming. This is to come back to your question, dear Thomas, and to mention that there's a hyper-intensification around agriculture and food for all of the reasons that we already mentioned. But I believe that we need to understand that there are some states that accelerate in this field. We could think about Russia, who rearmed economically and aimed on its agriculture primarily. China that cannot do without food security at home, and taking into account the
alimentaire.
issues has to look elsewhere, buying land, investing, buying harbors, industries around the world, investing in normative to change the regulations by being at the general direction of the FAO, Mrs. Ambassador. And China is doing a lot of work, as we could talk about a lot of African countries, South Africa, Morocco, Kenya. They are betting on agriculture as a lever of development, as a lever of security, as a
Par le
to
de nouvelles pratiques
to
écologiques.
be seen also from the rest of the world through innovation, startups, women entrepreneurship, etc. It's moving tremendously and changing. But the 21st century is not only about states, it's about companies. It's just not companies in that sector. I always say to those who are doubtful that agriculture is the future, let's look at what the great digital companies are doing, American or Chinese. I'm not going to name them. They really accelerated on farming because there's green finance. They talk about climate. They talk about life, your life on the daily basis. And there's nothing better than food with health.
La question
And by extension, the agricultural question. These companies are investing huge amounts of money on food innovation and agricultural innovation. Of course, there are funds, sovereign funds, mixed funds, pension funds. There's a great asset fund as well,
je vais pas le citer.
which ends in ROC, but I'm not going to quote it. It's not my objective. I don't want to publicize for them. But this asset funds managing millions of billions of dollars is putting 0.5% of its investment in food and agricultural sector. But it's higher than the FAO budget and others together. What I want to say is that there's a planet,
Les États,
whether states, institutions, funds, individuals, companies, NGOs, research, innovation, everyone is mobilizing for the biggest challenge in the world. As I said, it means security on a daily basis.
Thank you, Sébastien. Could you expand a little bit?
je peux en parler.
Yes, I can do that. Talking about colonization of Europe in the 19th century, we went to look for resources very far, resources which we did not have because we were at war with one another. We were not at peace. Going to high land, buy new lands is not something new. Looking for harvest or wheat in Sicily, for example, as was done in the past, when you're lacking resources for your own food safety or your own security, you go and look for it elsewhere. This is nothing new. Talking about getting hold of land outside of your own country, there is what we call something that is not respectful of the rules. And by getting resources outside of your own country, those that are the most active in doing this, it's not China. I'm not saying this, but the references or the database, rather, gives us the figures. The first three figures, the first three countries are Western countries. China is not the first responsible. Sometimes you can get foreign investments, which are welcome. Farmers need investments, they need incomes. Sometimes you need investment. There are many actions carried out in Europe which help farmers to get support for changing practices, for getting logistic support. We have other countries investing a lot because we have a fairly good system. If all of this is done in the respect of the farmers, but also the fishermen, if we do this in all respect by sharing core values and trying to improve everybody's food safety, we do need these types of investments. Unfortunately, we have
La réalité du monde, hein, on est
another reality. We are not in a perfect world, and therefore that also exists
malheureusement.
in the agricultural world. Thank you.
Maintenant, on va passer aux questions.
We're going to have a time for Q&A now. If you have questions, please raise your hand and people will
Par là.
bring you a mic.
Ce
We
sera
will
plus-
take one question at a time.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la
Thank you very much for the quality of your presentations. And
je me
I have several questions. First of all, how do your organizations work with the state or non-state actors and with the governments?
vos mises en œuvre de plans alimentaires sont-elles
How do your implementations depend
l'action des États
on state actions? Do you have levers for putting pressure on the states which do not want to collaborate with you? How do you work with the state stakeholders? Do you have any levers? And are you really independent of them? Thank you for your question. Who would like to answer this question?
On va donner la parole à Éric Pichon, qui lève la main.
Eric Pichon, I can answer, yes.
Par exemple,
For example, very clearly, if we look at Sahel, France, or EU rather, is cooperating with the group of countries from the Sahel, the J5 Sahel, on objectives, on development objectives or security objectives.
on a vu que c'est pas toujours facile, notamment par
We
exemple.
saw that it is not always easy. We saw this with Mali recently. What are the levers? Therefore, this is always difficult to implement.
C'est suspendre l'aide s'il y a des.
For example, suspending aid if there are any governance issues. We never suspend humanitarian aid, but if we suspend or stop some aid, of course, we know that there will be some impact that might not be beneficial. So what are the levers that we can have with the countries that we are working with?
Quand on intervient dans un.
When we work in a third country, there is always an agreement. And normally the third country has to define its own development objectives.
Ce sont les leviers, ce sont des leviers politiques, de discussion, un tas de choses qui entrent en œuvre, mais c'est pas évident.
There are other things, but it's not always easy.
Merci. Et peut-être que Mme Jürgensen voulait aussi répondre par rapport aux organisations internationales.
Mrs. Jurgensen, would you like to say something about this? If you are still with us?
Merci beaucoup. Ben,
Yes.
les organisations internationales, par
International organizations are working with the states by definition. States are members of organization, international organization, and the EU is a member of the FAO.
négociations,
There is a whole negotiation, bargaining work that needs to be done to see how we can come to a consensus. Not always easy. We have to work with different countries from various geographical zones regarding school food. It's mainly with African countries, Rwanda, Burkina Faso, Senegal, etc. And besides states, even though they might not be fully members of the organizations, we are also working with other organizations, with civil society. There are discussions which are not always easy when it comes to this private sector. How do we associate the private sector?
il y a des besoins d'associer le secteur.
There is a need to include or involve the private sector, but this has to be done in the right way with proper rules and norms to make sure that it will not just be a certain number of companies, but also the local private sector.
On essaye de-
A whole range of things have to be done.
Et puis aussi,
This is what we're trying to do,
on peut rencontrer
also with the farmers whom we meet, and also research institutes.
il y a
At Rome, in Rome, there is much work being done, much partnership being done with research institute or centers. We need to understand what is the world like so that we can find solutions. Maybe one last element in our relationships with the states. Our association respects each government in each of the countries that we work with. I insisted earlier on the fact that farmers were also affected by the food issue, but they can also bring solutions. And through our organizations, we are generating activity, incomes, women, for young people, for women, and we also carry advocacy. This is also part of our mission to support our partners, to help them defend their own interests. For example, the farmers, or we are here to help them meet maybe some ministers or some leaders, and this was successful in some cases. Just to bounce back on what you were saying earlier on, yes, Pam had some aircrafts during the pandemic, but we also working with local producers. It's important to say that the capacity that African farmers have to feed the continent, the mini dairies in Burkina Faso. How can PAM help the dairy sector in Burkina Faso? We want to help both the producers and the consumers. Are there differences between producers in Europe and Western Africa? Yes, there is a common ground, which is to make a living, a decent living, out of one's business.
Merci.
Pardon, est-ce que je peux juste rebondir parce que
Oui, bien sûr.
I'd like to bounce back on what
je voulais pas donner l'impression que
has been said. I didn't want to give the impression that the PAM is importing all its food.
travail
All other organizations and the PAM, of course, work alongside local farmers. We are here to help them, help these countries to develop what the PAM, the World Food Organization or program,
et puis aussi
is to bring alongside or bring in other goods which are missing or products which are missing in the country. But of course, our basis is to first and foremost to work with the local farmers and strengthen the local farming. There is a whole system with shops
pour faire vivre ces activités
in order to help farmers, local farmers, make a living.
et pendant la pandémie, c'est
During the pandemic,
personnel humanitaire, des
we have medical staff, social staff, and the diplomatic staff
prendre leur poste
who, in order to come back to France, they were able to use a PAM aircraft.
Oui, non, juste moi, ce que je voudrais dire, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de jeunes dans la
There are many young people here.
Il faut considérer qu'aujourd'hui,
Unfortunately, if we look at this whole equation of food safety, we do need all the skills necessary. We should not oppose the NGOs, producers from the south, from the north. We need to mobilize all the talents, all the skills possible, all the stakeholders possible. There is a great challenge, which is to understand that a farmer would cover various activities in a day time. Sometimes is using drones, using digital, going to the markets, using technology. I want to encourage young people who are to go and do engineering, agricultural engineering, go and work in this sector, which is at the crossroads of international solidarity. With this kind of training, you may not necessarily become a farmer, but when you go to training for agronomy, you can work in a company, you can work in the public sphere, you can work in diplomacy, you can work alongside producers.
Bilan carbone épouvantable parce qu'on a besoin d'énergie.
We need terrible energy, multiple energy to meet the issue of food safety. We need competencies, skills coming from everywhere. We're going to need to hybrid a lot of knowledge and know-how. There's going to be an incredible energy to reinvent and reinvest in these trades or jobs. It's no use spending hours talking about food safety and peace in the world if we do not explain to the young people today that this is the greatest challenge of this century. There are great jobs. It's not just about working in cities, not just about working in certain businesses which are always put up front. Go into this field and you will be in concrete action. You will never get bored. I hope the message got through.
C'était important de le dire. Oui. Bonne formation. Il y avait des questions par ici.
Any other questions?
Et après, par là.
Oui, on me dit de me lever, alors je le fais. Je suis d'accord tout à fait avec vous sur...
I agree with what has just been said. I worked at the telecom in the administration services. The first customer at the Orange Telecom was agriculture. We are in a maritime region.
C'est quand même les 4/5 de la planète.
Fishermen also are an important part of the sector.
Au monde, on a
France is the second maritime field in France.
maritime.
If the maritime resources were to collapse, I don't know how we would tackle the hunger issue. I think we should be talking about this a lot more as well. Not just fishing, I'm talking about
Professionnels eux-mêmes où
professionals are to
mais les enjeux sont beaucoup
make do, but the challenges are much more global than local.
les effets de l'agriculture et
There is opposition between agriculture and
comment on gère
the state of the oceans.
coordonnées, comment on gère
We are talking about coordinating ourselves. How do we handle this?
ces domaines qui vont être aussi importants que les fonds marins
And how do we do this for other areas which are just as important as
en train de se développer. Ça peut pas être simple.
the oceans?
Transporter 90%.
It's not just about transporting 90% of the merchandise or pushing back the migrants.
Nature.
We have a conception in our relationship to nature.
Indigène nous parlait de la forêt. Toute la passion.
An indigenous person was talking to us about the forest, but the same goes for the oceans. We should be talking also about water, drinking water. Just to give you one example,
J'étais il y a 2 ans sur le Mekong.
just 2 years ago, I was at the Mekong. I met people there for the first time.
L'embouchure du fleuve maintenant.
We realized that the strait of the Mekong is more of a soft water.
C'est de la folie.
And people said, don't worry, we can sell shrimps instead of rice.
Population
But what it represents in terms of rice production for the whole of the Asian population, maybe for the markets, they can get by selling shrimps instead of rice.
C'est difficile de ne pas vouloir répondre parce qu'il y a 3 choses. D'abord,
3 things, of course. I totally agree. I said it very quickly. World food safety will have to go through the oceans. We should call our planet oceans or seas rather than planet Earth. It's the climate lung of the world, and it's a crossroads of geopolitical tensions.
Et stratégique, mais c'est aussi toute la question climatique.
But it's also the whole climate issue. There is an issue about the sustainability of fish. France and Europe have underinvested in that sector. We're talking a lot about the blue economy. There's a whole sector that needs to be looked at. We need to be talking more and more about the blue food and the blue products, which should be doubling in production by 2050 in order to meet the demand, mainly because the status quo of the meat production. Secondly, what you have said about drinking water, just to remind everyone that the first products that people consume in the world is drinking water. You can stop eating for a day or a few days, but drinking water is the first foods that we take in. And there is a connection to the seas. Tomorrow we're going to have to be drinking unsalted seas more and more so. My wife is from Vietnam. You talked about Vietnam. But this is true. We are making choices in the world today. For example, Vietnamese shrimps is the second product for the whole country. Around the resources of the Mekong River. These choices are political choices. This is what was saying the ambassador.
Et là, les politiques publiques doivent accompagner.
And public policies need to support dynamics which need to be virtuous in order to create revenues. But we need to also think about future generations.
Let's look about what the international organizations are doing with the sea. Yes, this is a challenge that is followed closely by the FAO, which finally is misnamed. We see it usually through the agricultural lens, but we need to look at all the sustainable management of natural resources, and the question of the ocean, of the sea, aquaculture is really rising tremendously at the FAO and everything that revolves around agri-food, green food. At the FAO, we have a committee where all of the member states gather. It's the fishing committee also, and they wondered whether there was an international consultation. This takes place, namely there are other times, but at the FAO with a fishing committee, and we talk about all these challenges, illicit fishing, sustainability, how we can maintain a decent income in a COVID crisis context. A lot of informal discussions, and the consequences of the COVID crisis were in this informal sector were very important, namely for women. There are a lot of challenges, and of course we are following this. It's a major challenge, and it will be so more and more. Thank you. Let's go to the next question. A gentleman here is raising his hand.
Merci.
Thank you. So a great thanks for all this to all the speakers, because there was a lot of content, and I really appreciated what Sébastien said. Especially, I'm a peasant, I'm a farmer, so I really appreciate hearing this. It's very rare on a set. The beneficiaries of the PAC, some indirect, are the consumers. The direct ones are the consumers before the farmers. I have two comments and one question.
Les enjeux sont clairs.
The challenges are clear. They were well defined, I believe.
Le lien entre
The
l'agriculture
link between agriculture and peace in the world. There are environmental objectives,
on aimerait avoir une cohérence.
and we need a coherence in public policies and inside our sphere, European Union. I'll take an example which is often polemical, glyphosate. You know this. Europe decided, and I think it's a good thing to say that if this project is dangerous, it must be prohibited. But there are other public policies in the EU, whatever the color, majority of the governments that compose Europe, we are confronted to a liberalization of the markets, which forbids the idea that we could forbid the entry on the territory of the EU products that do not answer to these environmental rules. It is not the only contradiction. We also see it, the link between consuming locally and for preventing or forbidding or not taking the right measures that allow consumers, when they buy products, to know the origins of the products, of what they will buy. So these elements are at times misunderstood in the way the measures that are taken, adopted. So I have a question. I often wonder about the competition that exists in countries that are suffering or suffering from hunger, the competition between the industrial
culture industrielle, on peut parler du coton, par exemple.
We could talk about cotton, for example, those that are cultures that are made for export.
Le cacao.
Coffee, tea, cacao. This is the end of the interpretation. Thank you.
Qui sont pas piqués des hannetons, pour parler un peu vulgairement. Et je me demande si, dans ces pays où régulièrement on souffre d'approvisionnement alimentaire, la concurrence que les pays occidentaux exercent sur une partie des terres, alors en faisant travailler les gens localement, certes, mais si cette concurrence-là n'est pas nuisible à l'équilibre alimentaire pour un certain nombre de pays. Puis un peu dans le gag, on parle de l'Afghanistan comme étant un territoire où il y a des soucis d'approvisionnement alimentaire. C'est lié aux événements plus récents. Mais est-ce que la culture du pavot exerce une concurrence sur les terres par rapport à ce qui permettrait aux gens de se nourrir sur place?
Merci. On va demander à Éric Pichon de rebondir sur la cohérence de l'Union européenne, par exemple, dans ses décisions.
Oui, je crois que je peux être d'accord avec monsieur sur un certain nombre de points. Alors, il y a des efforts qui sont faits, effectivement, puisque, par exemple, récemment, la Commission européenne a proposé d'éviter d'importer de la déforestation, sous-entendu. C'est-à-dire, on essaye d'éviter d'importer des produits qui ont été pris au détriment des forêts. Ça veut dire qu'on peut diminuer notre consommation de certaines crèmes chocolatées ou d'autres choses. Il y a ces tendances-là, mais effectivement, du point de vue des marchés, l'Europe a une vision libérale qui est celle qui est actuellement, qui vise à un équilibre des choses par le biais du marché. Pour l'instant, les choses en sont là. Après, il y a des efforts qui sont faits. Et par exemple, si on revient sur le pacte vert, sur la réforme de la PAC, l'objectif de l'Union européenne d'avoir en 2030 un quart de ces terres en bio, de diminuer les pesticides et de comme vous le disiez, et faire en sorte que ça devienne un standard, ça a déjà suscité la colère des Américains en disant vous allez vous allez interdire donc des imports de produits qui ne correspondent pas à vos standards. alors que ce genre de standard va faire que la production va diminuer, et si la production diminue, on ne pourra pas diminuer, on ne pourra pas nourrir le monde. Donc, je caricature le débat, mais c'est un peu ce genre d'arguments qui sont en train de s'affronter. Donc, voilà, je ne peux que me faire l'écho de ce que vous dites, monsieur, et vous dire que c'est un débat qui existe aussi au sein de l'Union européenne. Et encore une fois, on est dans l'élaboration des politiques publiques et on est dans les rapports de force. Donc, après, au sein de l'Union européenne, il y a tout un tas de mécanismes qui font que les choses s'équilibrent, qu'on a toujours, par exemple, une politique de développement qui est très généreuse, et à côté de ça, on a une politique commerciale qui est très offensive. Donc c'est,
merci,
en dire de mon point de vue d'analyste et non pas d'homme politique.
Claire, vous vouliez peut-être rebondir sur la concurrence.
Un mot sur l'opposition entre culture vivrière et culture de rente. Dans les organisations que l'on côtoie et les producteurs que l'on côtoie, c'est pas forcément une opposition si binaire que ça. Un agriculteur a aussi besoin de sources de revenus pour acheter ce qu'il ne peut pas produire sur son exploitation, pour scolariser ses enfants, pour acheter des vêtements. Et la solution n'est pas forcément dans le vivrier à tout prix. Après, de là à pousser peut-être à l'extrême, mais je ne connais pas le contexte de l'Afghanistan, c'est peut-être effectivement d'autres données. Mais la culture de coton, on l'a vu au Mali auprès des producteurs qu'on accompagnait, et aussi une manière d'accéder au crédit dans un certain nombre de cas, ce que le vivrier ne permet pas. D'accéder à certains intrants, ce que le vivrier ne permet pas. Donc effectivement, dans un certain nombre de cas, la culture de rente est aussi un levier du développement agricole local.
Vous vouliez rebondir sur la culture de l'opium ?
Non, parce que le sujet de l'Afghanistan montre que vous avez des productions agricoles à très haute valeur ajoutée qui ne sont pas forcément des productions licites. Mais ça me permet de rappeler quand même, parce qu'on a beaucoup mis l'accent sur la variable alimentaire dans cette table ronde, et à dessein, je voudrais juste quand même rappeler, si c'était nécessaire, que l'agriculture ne fait pas uniquement que nourrir. Grâce à l'agriculture et les productions agricoles, vous avez une partie de production d'énergie renouvelable aujourd'hui. Vous avez une activité horticole qui permet d'offrir des fleurs et d'avoir des activités de jardinage. Je vous rappelle également que vous pouvez vous habiller grâce à l'agriculture. Monsieur parlait du coton, on pourrait dire la même chose du lin, d'autant plus qu'on est en Normandie. Je vous rappelle que 70% de la production mondiale de lin est faite en Normandie. C'est le produit qui fait rayonner massivement la Normandie dans le monde. Pour le dire autrement, si vous avez du lin sur vous, vous portez un bout de Normandie sur la peau. C'est ça la réalité du lin. C'est une production qui équipe pas juste les raquettes de tennis Décathlon ou les pistes d'athlétisme, c'est aussi un moyen de s'habiller. Et puis je vais prendre un dernier exemple pour que tout le monde comprenne. La betterave, ce n'est pas un produit agricole très sexy, attractif, connu. La betterave, ça permet en France, pas uniquement de faire des carrés de sucre, ça permet de faire un mix énergétique et de mettre de l'essence avec davantage de produits issus de la biomasse grâce à ces énergies renouvelables qu'on développe. Et puis, ça nous permet de nous laver les mains, parce que je rappelle que la betterave en France, aujourd'hui, fait 10 à 15% de la production de gel hydroalcoolique. Donc, je rappelle tout ça pour insister sur le fait que si je plaide pour un prix Nobel de la paix pour les agriculteurs, c'est aussi parce qu'ils ne font pas uniquement une production alimentaire, ils sont sur plein d'autres segments et utilisations de produits de notre quotidien sans qu'on s'en rende compte parfois.
Merci. Il me semble qu'il restait une dernière question du monsieur là-bas. Il nous reste 2 minutes.
Oui, on a parlé du Burkina Faso là tout à l'heure. J'aime bien parce que on parlait de la mini-laiterie. Mais la mini-laiterie, quand vous allez dans la boutique en face, cette mini-laiterie, vous trouvez de la poudre de lait qui coûte nettement moins cher. Bon, on ne sait même pas d'où elle vient d'ailleurs. On suppose que ça vient d'Europe et que ça a été subventionné pour arriver là et être moins cher que le lait du Burkina. C'est bien embêtant. Alors, M. Pichon nous parlait d'une nécessité de cohérence. Bon, là-dedans, il faut la rechercher, la cohérence. Hein. On ne la voit pas au premier coup. Bon, puis il y a une autre forme d'agriculture dans le Sahel. Depuis 40 ans, des leaders burkinabés ont prêché pour le développement du maraîchage. Ils ont tellement bien prêché qu'ils ont fini par être entendus. Et aujourd'hui, on peut voir des camions de 35 tonnes de tomates, 35 tonnes par camion. Le lendemain, ces camions sont sur le marché d'Abidjan. Bon, on voit du chou pour le Ghana, le Togo et le Bénin. Donc une zone a priori pauvre est capable d'exporter des légumes en direction de pays nettement plus riches. Et comment on a fait ça? Très simplement, il faut une réserve d'eau dans le village. Hein. Un barrage, ça coûte 200 ou 300 000 euros. Quand vous avez quelques dizaines d'hectares de barrage, vous pouvez alimenter les jardins pendant toute une saison sèche, pendant 8 mois. Et les gens qui ont une parcelle de 500 mètres carrés, des fois peut-être 1000 mètres carrés, non seulement ils font vivre leur famille, mais en plus ils n'ont plus besoin d'émigrer. Et ça, c'est très important. L'émigration est une souffrance. Aller en Côte d'Ivoire, travailler dans les plantations de café et de cacao, dans des conditions qui sont proches, ça ressemble plus ou moins à l'esclavage, pour 200 € par an, c'est vraiment pas la peine d'aller en Côte d'Ivoire. On fait un jardin chez soi au Burkina, et à ce moment-là, on a un revenu nettement supérieur.
Merci. Claire, vous voulez répondre par rapport notamment à la concurrence entre le lait en poudre et...
Alors, sur le potentiel de production sur le continent africain, je pense qu'on se rejoint. Sur l'opposition entre la poudre de lait et le lait local, il est clair que dans un certain nombre de cas, il y a des formes de distorsion de concurrence. Elle n'est pas forcément toujours aussi automatique que ça. Le président de l'Union des mini-laiteries, des producteurs de lait avec lesquels on est en partenariat au Burkina, le reconnaît lui-même. Aujourd'hui, la production locale ne peut pas répondre aux besoins des consommateurs locaux. Par contre, l'enjeu est que dans sa politique européenne, dans sa politique agricole, l'Union européenne et dans les stratégies d'accompagnement des investisseurs normands ou autres sur le continent africain, soit bien pris en compte l'existence d'une production locale. Et c'est là où on a peut-être beaucoup à progresser. Nous, on n'arrive pas dans un désert. Il y a des producteurs locaux et ils ont besoin aussi d'outils de transformation et on peut travailler ensemble pour développer une filière laitière durable. Peut-être avec du lait en poudre à court terme et peut-être, on l'espère, demain avec uniquement du lait local. Il y a bien des concurrences sur certains produits, notamment des poudres de lait réengraissées avec des matières grasses végétales qui, elles, cassent le marché aujourd'hui. Mais sur un certain nombre de produits, les prix peuvent être proches après reconstitution. Et il est aussi important de ne pas forcément uniquement déformer, opposer les producteurs, mais bien informer les différentes parties.
Merci. Je vous propose de clore ce débat. Je remercie d'abord nos 4 intervenants. Je vous remercie d'avoir écouté. Et je voudrais préciser que vous pouvez retrouver sur le site de Forum de la Paix des informations supplémentaires, des liens, notamment le lien de l'entretien avec la mini-laiterie. Vous pouvez trouver tout ça sur le site web. Voilà. Merci à vous et bonne soirée.
C'est là-bas.